Join me as we unlock the stories of the past, turning the pages of history to discover the vibrant lives, struggles, and triumphs that have shaped our world. You're standing in a field dotted with wildflowers, the late afternoon sun drenching everything in golden warmth. In the distance, a maypole sways slightly in the breeze, ribbons fluttering like laughter in the wind. Sheep bleat somewhere nearby. A lad catches your eye. You glance back. Carefully, not too eagerly. You blink twice just to be clear and tilt your head slightly. Congratulations, you've just flirted medieval style. There's no swiping left or right here. There's eye contact. Very regulated, sometimes scandalous eye contact. Courtship in the medieval world was a bit like playing chess only with a priest, watching your parents judging from the sidelines and half the village making bets. You are keenly aware of your body language. A glance held too long at a churchyard picnic. It might send the wrong signal. A dropped kerchief on the way to the well bold. Very bold. In some towns, gestures like that were actually written into the bylaws. Too much eye flirting could get you a fine for inappropriate signaling, believe it or not. You'd think you were a lighthouse. Now, this is no romantic comedy. If you were a peasant, your opportunities to meet someone were limited to feast days, seasonal fairs, or maybe during communal chores. Fancy hauling hay with potential suitors eyeing your pitchfork technique. Still, you had options. One of the more charming ones was walking out a sort of paired stroll during public festivals where you could chat, blush, and hopefully not trip over a goat. Or there were the nighttime gatherings where unmarried youth would sing, dance, and flirt under the careful but often distracted eye of the village elders. All entirely wholesome until the sun set and someone brought out the cider. But say you were a bit higher up the social ladder. As a merchant's daughter or a young knight, you'd attend more refined affairs, banquets, tournaments. Even church processions could double as the medieval version of speed dating minus the bell. You might exchange glances across the nave as a particularly slow chant drones on and on. You begin to wonder whether Brother William ever suspects he's providing the soundtrack to your daydreams. One surprisingly popular move involved flowers. Give the wrong one and you might offend. Give the right one, like a sprig of rosemary or a red carnation, and you'd be sending very direct signals. One anonymous 14th century letter from a young woman to her sweetheart read, "I give you this posy, and with it my favor. Keep it, lest you forget me." The paper was wrapped around a dried sprig of lavender and tied with dyed thread. Historians still argue whether it was actual affection or social expectation that prompted these tokens. Either way, it's basically the medieval version of texting thinking of you. Of course, sometimes glances and flowers weren't enough. You might hum a certain tune near someone's door or even carve a love sign into a tree discreetly with a dull knife, praying no one saw you and assumed you were hexing the livestock. And it wasn't always subtle. During spring festivals like Beltane or May Day, the rules bent a little. Youth would pair off sometimes by lottery, sometimes by choice, and vanish into the woods to, let's say, collect firewood. Some came back with stories, others came back with suspicious glows and twigs in their hair. A few came back engaged, or pregnant, or both. But even among all this rustic romance, there were still awkward moments. Like stepping on a girl's hem during a dance and ripping it, or sneezing during your first stolen glance across the barley field, or finding out the handsome shepherd you've been dreaming about is actually your third cousin twice removed and recently engaged to someone else in the next village. And sometimes you just never know if someone liked you or not. You'd try to interpret their posture during the wheat threshing, or whether their tunic looked particularly well ironed. You'd replay that single smile for a week, unsure if it was meant for you or the person beside you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And post your location and local time. I love seeing where you're listening from. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because that glance across the field, the one you're still thinking about as you drift towards sleep, it might be the start of something beautiful. Or just another cautionary tale told by the village baker who saw everything by the way. The marketplace hums with clinking coins, haggling voices, and the occasional angry goose underfoot. You're not here for apples or onions today, not really. You're scanning the crowd for one particular face, and there by the basket of pears a flicker of a smile. He saw you. Now comes the hard part, sending a message without actually saying anything aloud. In the medieval dating game, words weren't always safe. Between nosy neighbors, judgmental priests, and the ever-watchful gaze of your parents, most early-stage flirting had to happen without speaking. Which is why secret codes and subtle notes flourish like mildew on a monastery wall. Let's say you're a clever wool spinner with a bit of Latin and a lot of imagination. You might sneak your feelings into an embroidered edge of a tunic, just a few initials, maybe a red thread, stitched in a knot pattern known to only you and him. Or you might bake a message into a honey cake using herbs for flavor that actually spelled out something far sweeter in meaning. Time for courage. Rosemary for remembrance. Mint for, well, freshness. Romantic hygiene mattered too. Letters, though rare, were another method of medieval matchmaking. If you were lucky enough to be literate or have a friend who was, you might dictate a letter filled with flowery metaphors, borrowed poetry, and at least one reference to the pain of being apart. A popular phrase, "My heart is chained to yours with sorrow's iron." Subtle, right? Even better if it was sealed with wax bearing your family crest or your pet duck's footprint if you were creatively underfunded. Some suitors used objects instead of parchment. A carved wooden comb could imply admiration. A ribbon subtly dyed with saffron might suggest wealth, or simply that someone ruined a perfectly good spice for your sake. There's one recorded account of a suitor delivering a live rabbit wearing a collar of violets to a girl he admired. Romantic slightly, confusing, very, especially for the rabbit. But one of the strangest, most beloved tokens was the fruit basket. And no, not the kind you send to your in-laws. In the 13th century, young women might send an admirer a small basket containing symbolic fruit, a pear for desire, a fig for fertility, a plum for sincerity, a turnip. That's a mystery. Historians still argue whether it meant "you're boring, I'm taken," or "I just had too many root vegetables." Now, if you were wealthier and more refined, you might receive something like an illuminated manuscript page, hand-painted with initials entwined in floral borders. Some were true art. Others were, let's say, enthusiastically bad. One clumsy noble in Provence sent a lady a page where his face was drawn as a smiling sun surrounded by pigs. Apparently, he meant to say he'd light up her world and care for her like livestock. She married a bookseller instead. In courts across Europe, troubadours made this code even more complex. They performed songs filled with layered meanings using the language of birds' flowers or even chess moves. One particularly dramatic tune from 1220 features the phrase, "My pawn kneels before your rook." Interpret that how you will. But secrecy came with risk. You never knew who might intercept your message. One maid in Yorkshire misdelivered a lover's note into a bishop's sermon binder. That Sunday's homily took a sudden, passionate turn, And in some cities, especially those with strict moral codes, possessing love charms or secret tokens could be considered suspicious, even criminal. One statute in 14th century Florence warned against objects of impure affection exchanged without parental consent. Imagine explaining that at a town hearing. Still, lovers persisted. A girl might send her suitor a handkerchief soaked in rose water, fragrant, elegant, and hopefully not previously used. A boy might leave a small figurine by her windowsill, a knight carved from bone bowing eternally. Sweet, unless it was your cousin doing it. Of course, all of this operated under the assumption that you knew how to read the signs. Not everyone did. You might misinterpret a gesture and send a very earnest basket of figs to someone, just asking you to move out of the way. Or worse, you'd wait for weeks after offering a posy of marjoram, assuming the message had been received only to find out they were allergic. Still, when it worked, it worked. There are recorded cases of couples who courted for months through exchange tokens alone before ever speaking face to face. And when they finally did, it was usually awkward, sweaty, and accompanied by at least one hiccup, but still undeniably human. That's the charm of it all. Beneath the lace, the laws, the layers of wool, and suspicion was a longing to connect, to be seen, to be chosen. Even if all you had was a turnip, a ribbon, and a prayer that your coded message didn't accidentally propose marriage to the blacksmith. You step outside and there they are, your parents. Just standing there, not doing anything in particular except breathing heavily with the weight of centuries of expectation. They don't say it outright, but the look is clear. We saw you near the baker's boy again. Dating in medieval times didn't happen in private. It couldn't, because everyone from your nosy aunt to the traveling tanner had something to say about it. You weren't just dating one person, you were courting an entire community. Let's start with your parents. Medieval families, especially among the merchant and noble classes, viewed romantic choices less as emotional journeys and more like strategic conquest. Love was nice, but a strong alliance was better. Your mother may have happened to mention a neighbor's unmarried son over dinner again. Or your father might have invited a certain widow's daughter to help with hay storage. Nothing says romantic possibility quite like stacking hay under the supervision of 4 adults and a goat named Matilda. If you were lucky, your parents were kind, but meddlesome. If you weren't, they were practically bodyguards with church bells. And that's before you factor in the neighbors. Because everyone in a small village had opinions and everyone had ears, including children who would gleefully chant rhymes if you so much as walked near your supposed sweetheart twice in one day. You remember it well, Tom and Ellie sitting in a ditch SPIEing for a marriage switch. Catchy, if not entirely accurate. Then there were the chaperones. Sometimes it was a servant, sometimes a sibling. Occasionally an uncle who took his role far too seriously and insisted on accompanying you everywhere with a suspiciously large walking stick. You and your potential beloved could walk side by side, but only if you left room for God, a cleric, and a hefty dose of judgment. In cities, it could get even more invasive. Urban households were often tightly packed, and wealthier families employed a rotating roster of attendants maids and older cousins whose main job seemed to be interrupting any meaningful eye contact. One popular method involved pretending to check the firewood every 6 minutes during a conversation. Another was loudly offering irrelevant food. Pickled eel, anyone? No, just me. Still, people found ways. Secret notes passed in hymnals, whispered messages behind market stalls, a shared glance when the candlelight flickered just right, and of course the occasional well-timed distraction, a dropped bowl, a sneezing fit. Or the classic, I thought I saw a wolf shout just long enough for a stolen whisper. But not all supervision was so obvious. In some cases, local guilds or even town councils kept an eye on courtships, especially if marriage between apprentices or traders might affect business. A young weaver in Bruges, for instance, needed permission from his guild to formally court the daughter of a tanner. Why? Because if the courtship failed, it might lead to unpleasantness between trades, and no one wants a scandal involving spoiled leather and broken looms. There's also the peculiar tradition of church seating gossip. In many towns, families sat in assigned spots during services, and observers would speculate endlessly on proximity. If two unmarried people were seated even remotely near each other 3 Sundays in a row, rumors began. By week 4, a formal inquiry? By week 5, wedding bells. Or public shame, depends on the parish. One recorded case from a coastal village tells of a young couple separated mid-service by the priest who insisted their nearness was distracting to the choir. The choir, for the record, consisted of 2 elderly monks and a cat. Now, let's not forget the role of the maidservant. She might be your closest ally or your worst enemy. Some helped sneak messages and cover for stolen moments. Others leaked secrets to parents in exchange for better wages or simply because they liked drama. There are multiple 14th century diary fragments in which young women complain about that awful Joan who tattles like a parrot on fire. Historians still argue whether chaperoning traditions were rooted more in protection or control. Probably both. Certainly among the nobility, surveillance had everything to do with preserving reputation, lineage, and property. Among common folk, it was more about making sure no one got in trouble before the harvest festival. And yet, despite all this oversight, medieval romances still bloomed awkward, beautiful, and full of workarounds. You'd arrange to pass by your crush's house at just the right time. You'd volunteer for the same church cleaning duty armed with a bucket and an alibi. You'd memorize the schedule of every person who could ruin the moment and pray they all got called away to deal with a cow emergency. Because even in a world where love required a permit, 3 witnesses, and a sworn statement of intentions, people still longed to be close, to connect, to share a smile that meant something more even if it had to be delivered between 2 suspiciously placed barrels of salted herring. So tonight, as you rest your head and imagine a world of straw beds and whispering candlelight, know this: love always finds a crack in the wall, a pause in the conversation, a moment between footsteps. Even if someone's great aunt is watching from behind the curtains, with her knitting needles ready to strike. You're standing in a dusty kitchen, your hands damp with anxiety and dishwater. Across the room sits a local matchmaker pinching a goose feather between 2 fingers, as if it might reveal your entire future. He's got 3 goats, 1 cow, and a half-acre of barley, she says. Also a wart on his chin, shaped like a fish, but no one's perfect. In the medieval world, falling in love was all well and good, but marriage was business. It was inheritance, reputation, alliance. A good match meant more than butterflies. It meant access to better grazing land, the right to use a neighbor's well, or a boost in social standing. Sometimes all 3. Love might sneak in the back door, but economics sat loudly at the head of the table. And so we arrive at the dowry, your family's price tag for letting you leave the nest. If you were a daughter, your dowry was your golden ticket or your stumbling block. It might include coins, land, livestock, linens, or even a particularly nice butter churn. There's one record of a dowry in rural Burgundy that included 3 pigs, 12 beehives, and an aggressive goose named Elfrid. That's romance. If you were a son, on the other hand, you were often expected to receive a dowry and maybe offer a bride price of your own depending on local custom. Some areas flipped the dynamic entirely. In parts of Scandinavia, it was the groom's job to show he could financially support a wife, typically by proving he owned a functioning roof and at least one winter-ready cloak. Now, these weren't always cold transactions. Plenty of couples genuinely liked each other and still went through these steps. But make no mistake, negotiations could get heated. Uncles might argue over property lines. Fathers might throw in a bonus sheep if the groom's reputation was questionable. And somewhere in the corner, you'd sit pretending not to hear while wondering whether strong shoulders outweighed mild halitosis. Marriageable worth was a complicated stew of lineage status and resources. A noblewoman with little land might still be prized for her family name. A skilled tradesman's daughter might attract attention with her weaving talent and sturdy dowry chest. And sometimes the details got odd. One betrothal document from the 13th century specifies that the groom must never insult the bride's singing voice even under drunken conditions. That's not just love, that's foresight. So what happens if you fall in love with someone without a dowry? Or worse, if you're the one who has nothing to offer but a charming smile and a vague promise to make things work eventually? Well, let's just say medieval love didn't always reward dreamers. You might try eloping, but be prepared to face fines, exile, or even excommunication if caught. Or you might lean heavily on a sympathetic cleric, hoping he'll bend the rules and perform the wedding quietly for the good of your eternal souls and his sermon material. Historians still argue whether the dowry system empowered or restricted women. In some regions, a large dowry gave a woman more leverage in marriage, and she might retain partial control over it. In others, it served mainly to shift ownership of her future from one man to another. Either way, the concept made matchmaking a group project and privacy a fantasy, and inheritance. That was the long game. Some marriages were arranged specifically to merge estates or consolidate titles. Others were delayed or denied because marrying too soon might upset a precarious will. There's a famously awkward case in Lombardy where two teenagers were engaged at age 6, but couldn't marry until the girl's grandmother relinquished control of the family goat pasture. She held on until 83. Even when emotions ran high, paperwork ran higher. You'd need a notary, 2 witnesses, and often a formal public announcement. In some towns, a crying of the banns was performed on 3 consecutive Sundays to give anyone time to object. That meant, of course, that the whole village knew your business, and if someone did object, well, things got dramatic. And yet within all this legal wrangling and social maneuvering, real affection still found a foothold. Couples danced together under canopies of spring flowers. They exchanged carved tokens. They whispered in kitchens after the negotiations were done. The business of marriage may have started with coin counting and land measuring, but often it ended with 2 people sharing a laugh as they tried to carry an overly generous dowry chest up a crooked set of stairs. So tonight, if you're lying in bed wondering whether love can really survive accountant's livestock, and a panel of grumpy in-laws know that it can, it did. Even when it had to ride to the ceremony on a cart pulled by Elfred the dowry goose. The rooster crows and your day begins not with poetry or pillow talk, but with mud on your shoes and turnip stew already simmering. You pull on your only tunic still slightly damp from yesterday's rain, and as you step outside, you spot her. Across the field, carrying a bundle of firewood. Her hair is a bit windblown. She looks tired. So do you. But there it is, the flutter, the glance, the slight smile. You're in love. Probably. Peasant dating, you see, didn't have the luxury of time or privacy. Life was hard, wet, and full of back pain. If you were a farmer, a thatcher, a washerwoman, or a swineherd, Your romantic journey likely played out between chores, shared glances while milking goats, quick chats at the communal oven, maybe a moment of flirtation while shelling peas. There was no grand courtship, no serenade under balconies. Just a reality where affection might bloom over a mutual hatred of mucking out the pigsty. Still, it wasn't all grime. Many peasants found genuine companionship. You'd work together, laugh at the same bad weather, complain about the same ties. There are reports of couples who slowly fell in love during planting season and were married by harvest with a cow as witness and a bread loaf as dowry. But travel up the social ladder and everything changes. You're no longer just dating a person, you're navigating etiquette, chivalry, and about 14 layers of velvet. Nobles had their own rules. Courting was a game of appearances, letters, carefully chosen words, and absolutely no visible emotions in public. As a noblewoman, you might receive a suitor during a formal sitting with a chaperone present and a fan poised to shield any reaction. As a young knight or courtier, you'd practice your bow for hours just to get it almost right, and then be told your hand placement still looked unrefined. Instead of gardens or goat sheds, noble romance happened in tapestried halls, jousting tournaments, and carefully arranged walks in the courtyard, never alone, of course. You might be allowed to touch hands once during a dance, and even that would be the talk of the court for a week. Appearance mattered. Your shoes, your gloves, whether your cloak dragged too much or too little. If your poetry lacked proper meter, it could tank your chances entirely. There's one poor fellow recorded in a French courtly letter who rhymed love with shove and was promptly exiled from dinner invitations for a month. And then there were the gifts. Where a peasant might offer a smooth stone or a braid of wildflowers, noble suitors gave jeweled brooches, silk scarves, or expensive inks for writing letters. If you really wanted to show affection, you'd commission a miniature portrait, or at least have a scribe compose a suitably dramatic love confession that compared your beloved to the moon, or a falcon, or a slightly better dressed saint. But even nobility had its quirks. One German countess is said to have sent her suitor a roasted swan stuffed with rose petals and a note reading, "I await your reply before dessert." He never did write back, and historians still debate whether he was terrified or just full. Historians also argue whether noble romance was ever truly romantic. Some say it was more theater than emotion, especially since many noble marriages were arranged by families before the couple even met. But others point to surviving letters filled with longing and pain and the occasional terrible pun as proof that even behind all the pomp, real feelings bloomed. Still, the contrast between peasant and noble life was stark. One was full of sweat and directness, the other perfume and posturing. A peasant might fall in love over shared soup. A noble might pine for years with nothing but glances exchanged during feast days. And then sometimes worlds collided. A nobleman might fall for a peasant girl, usually to the horror of both families and the local clergy. These stories rarely ended well unless rewritten by later poets who gave them tragic gravitas. In reality, it usually ended with exile annulment or someone being sent to visit relatives in a faraway convent. But even in the humblest hut or the grandest manor, one thing remained constant: the need to be known, to be seen. Whether you were barefoot in the fields or laced up in brocade, that moment when two eyes met across a crowded space and held was something everyone understood. And you tonight, lying here in your soft bed, can imagine it. The damp earth underfoot, the distant chiming of a chapel bell, and the quiet thrill of knowing someone might just be thinking of you too. Whether you smell like lavender oil or sheep, a minefield of expectations dressed up in brocade and gilt. Because now you're in the world of noble courtship, and dating has become a performance. Not the spontaneous mud-splattered kind, but a slow, gilded theater where every word, glance, and sigh is weighed, noted, and possibly recorded in some cousin's diary. You're at a banquet. Musicians pluck lutes in the corner. Someone is juggling fruit inexplicably. The air smells faintly of roasted pheasant and ambition. You glance at your target air intended and hope your ruffled sleeve falls just right as you reach for your goblet. Success. They noticed. But don't look again. Looking twice is desperate. Unless you're French nobility, in which case it's practically a proposal. Among the elite, courtship followed very particular patterns shaped by social rank and often exaggerated notions of chivalry. You didn't just walk up to someone and declare your interest. No, you commissioned a poem, or staged a hunt, or jousted. Yes, actual jousting happened, because nothing says I find you charming like violently unseating another human in front of a crowd. One popular tactic was to engage in courtly love, a refined, often platonic expression of admiration, designed to elevate the lady usually married and torment the lover usually poetic. You'd sigh, dramatically write verses about her eyes being brighter than all the torches in the castle combined, and possibly fall into a bush while reciting them. It was performative, yes, but also gave nobles a socially acceptable way to flirt in public while pretending not to. Historians still argue whether courtly love ever led to actual relationships, or if it was just elaborate social fan fiction. Some suggest it allowed people to explore romantic expression in tightly controlled environments. Others say it was a glorified way to complain about your feelings without risking consequences. Either way, you probably weren't getting a kiss until at least page 7. But noble courtship wasn't all sighing and song. There were rules unspoken and very spoken. For example, you must never declare your love directly unless you were absolutely sure it was reciprocated and sanctioned by both families. Otherwise, you might find yourself exiled, married off to someone else, or dramatically forced into a monastery. Spoiler monasteries had surprisingly decent wine. And then there were the tests. Some ladies tested their suitors by setting them tasks: retrieve a rare flower rescue, a kitten write a 10-stanza ballad without using the word love. In one surviving example from Brittany, a young noblewoman demanded her admirer prove his devotion by walking barefoot over a frozen moat. He obliged, then promptly caught pneumonia. Love hurts. Contrast this with peasant life again, where a simple gift, maybe a wooden spoon or a plucked daisy, meant the world. Sure, it lacked flair, but it was real, unscripted. You saw someone, you liked them, you made them a cheese. That's sincerity. Back in the castle, meanwhile, everything you wore, said, or didn't say could be interpreted as a declaration or a slight. Wearing a lady's favor on your sleeve was literally that, tying a bit of her embroidery to your tunic in public to show devotion. If she removed it the next day, that was heartbreak and cross-stitch. Of course, noble dating also meant noble marriage arrangements. Rarely were matches made solely for love. Land titles and alliances drove everything. Two teenagers could be pledged to each other before they even had teeth. Actual affection often came later, if at all. And if you found yourself falling for someone beneath your station, well, then things got complicated. A noblewoman eloping with the blacksmith might find herself disinherited, hunted down, or locked in a tower. A nobleman seducing a servant might spark scandal or worse, a lawsuit. One tale from 14th century France tells of a lord who tried to marry a baker's daughter. His family responded by hiring 2 poets to publicly shame her lineage. The poems were bad. She married a miller instead. Even among equals, love would be risky. If your romance crossed political lines, say between rival houses, suddenly your love story became a diplomatic incident. Think Romeo and Juliet, but with more parchment and a slightly higher risk of war. Still within the velvet and varnish, some genuine love stories endured. Noble couples danced under moonlight, whispered behind tapestries, or met in rose gardens when the guards weren't looking. They risked scandal, exile, even arranged marriages to be together. And occasionally, just occasionally, a noble and a peasant would meet in the gray zone between classes through music or service or sheer stubborn fate. Their stories rarely made it into official chronicles, but a few songs survived, a few letters, a name carved into the back of a wooden prayer stool, heart-shaped and hidden. So whether you were hoeing potatoes or hosting a feast, one thing remained the same. Love never followed rules quietly. It barged in, messed everything up, and occasionally got someone thrown into a moat. You're standing in the shade of a stone cloister trying not to look like you're loitering, but you are absolutely loitering. Not far off, a young friar is pretending to read a psalter upside down. Between you, the air is thick with incense anticipation and is that goose stew? Someone's having a feast, but you're here for something more delicate. A blessing, a prayer, no, a date. Because in many medieval communities, love and matchmaking passed sometimes awkwardly through the long, bony fingers of the clergy. In towns and villages across Europe, your local priest wasn't just your spiritual guide. He was also a notary, a gossip hub, and in many cases, an unofficial matchmaker. Priests had unique insight into who was single, who was looking, and who had been sneaking around behind the granary. If you wanted to make a move, sometimes your first step wasn't toward your sweetheart, but toward the sacristy door. Sometimes these clerics took an active role in pairing people off. Maybe they knew of a recently widowed cooper looking to remarry, or a pious young woman whose parents were eager to see her settled before Lent. They'd gently suggest names during confession. Have you considered young Walter? He's quite devoted to Saint Apollonia, and even arrange introductions during feast day processions. Nothing like the smell of burning candles and roast ox to kindle romance. Of course, not all clergy played Cupid. Some were strict enforcers of moral boundaries, eager to snuff out anything resembling premarital flirtation. One particularly cranky abbot in 12th century Normandy banned young men from loitering outside the convent garden, citing prolonged lascivious glances through the hedge. Whether the hedge was particularly transparent remains unknown, but many were more forgiving. They understood that love was inevitable and that managing it was often better than banning it. So they offered counsel, facilitated quiet meetings, and sometimes performed weddings in secret when parents disapproved. One English rector even kept a locked chest full of unsanctioned marriage contracts for emergencies. Historians still argue whether these clandestine ceremonies were legally binding or just dramatic gestures with good intentions. Technically, all you needed for a legitimate marriage in the early Middle Ages was mutual consent. No priest, no church, not even a witness. Just two people saying, "I take thee with intent." The church later tightened control, but by then thousands of quiet woodland weddings had already happened, supervised by sympathetic friars or very confused shepherds. But sometimes the clergy weren't just facilitating romance, they were in it. Yes, despite vows of celibacy, many priests and monks had love lives, often complicated, occasionally scandalous, and surprisingly well documented. One 13th century Italian bishop kept a list of local priests who had unofficial housekeepers. Spoiler, all of them were young, unmarried women with strikingly similar handwriting. In some towns, these relationships were an open secret. People turned a blind eye as long as the priest did his job and kept things discreet. But woe to the cleric whose affair became too public. Punishments ranged from reassignment to public penance, like being forced to stand barefoot in the snow holding a candle. One monk in Bohemia reportedly wept during his punishment, not because of the frostbite, but because his beloved had married a brewer in the meantime. Tragic. And a little foamy. Not all clerical romances were illicit. In the early medieval period before mandatory celibacy was fully enforced, priests often had wives or concubines. Some even passed their positions down to their sons. Imagine being part of a priestly dynasty holy orders with hereditary benefits and a very awkward family Christmas. But by the High Middle Ages, church authorities began cracking down. Celibacy became a hot-button issue. Councils passed decrees, bishops scolded, and still love bloomed in the shadows. You can outlaw kisses, but you can't outlaw glances across candlelit choir stalls. And not all clergy kept things subtle. One Flemish friar is said to have written dozens of love poems under a female pen name, circulating them during confession as moral parables. Another nun carved a heart into her wooden writing desk initials hidden inside. Romance in Latin, in cursive, in code. Sometimes religious duties created opportunities for romance. Confession, for example, was oddly intimate. One 15th century noblewoman confessed to developing feelings for her confessor. He confessed, right back. They ran off together. It lasted 3 weeks. Turns out mutual guilt is not a strong foundation. And then there were the festivals, those vibrant holy days where clergy, peasants, and nobles mingled in markets and churches, all blinking awkwardly in the spring light. A priest might accidentally pair two attractive people for a ceremonial procession, or assign someone extra penance involving time spent in the chapel garden, conveniently when someone else was always there reading psalms. Matchmaking, perhaps. Divine scheduling. Almost certainly. So tonight, as you lie still and imagine stone chapels and flickering oil lamps, consider the strange duality of medieval clergy. The ones who blessed marriages forbade them, arranged them, hid them, and occasionally ran off with them. They were gatekeepers and participants, moral guides and mischief makers. And maybe somewhere deep in a monastery cellar there's still a box of unsent love letters, sealed with wax and stained with candle smoke, waiting to be discovered by someone who knows exactly what it means to love in silence. The sun is high, the air thick with the mingled scents of roast meat, spilled ale, and a questionable cheese turning green at the edges. You're elbow deep in a crowd of villagers, nobles, children, and dogs, some of which are better behaved than the humans. A troupe of musicians stumbles by, someone drops a pie, and across the way you lock eyes with someone carrying a basket of lavender and, inexplicably, a goose. Welcome to the medieval festival, where everything smells slightly fermented. Your feet are already tired, and love, true love, reckless love, or fleeting flirtation is just a maypole away. In the Middle Ages, public festivals and seasonal fairs were more than just an excuse to eat too much and watch a guy juggle knives while blindfolded. They were prime dating opportunities, especially for those without carriages, titles, or family chapels. When daily life offered little privacy, these communal bursts of celebration opened rare spaces where flirtation could bloom. And they came with the perfect disguise: you were all just here for the Saints' Day. You weren't. You were here to catch someone's eye while pretending to examine potatoes. Let's start with the spring festivals. Beltane May Day, Whitsuntide, where love practically dripped from every garland. Villagers would decorate doorways with greenery, dance around towering maypoles, and sometimes draw names from a hat to determine sweethearts for the day. These sweethearts weren't just decorative. They'd walk arm in arm, sing together, and occasionally sneak off to gather blossoms. Lots of blossoms. It's a miracle any flowers survived the season. If you were lucky, this springtime pairing turned into something more. If not, you awkwardly returned the borrowed ribbon the next morning and moved on. Unless you had a persistent aunt, in which case you'd never hear the end of it. Then there were harvest festivals equally robust in merrymaking, but more rooted in rustic traditions. You might join a haystacking contest, not because you're competitive, but because a certain someone is also competing and wearing that smock you like. There were games involving apples, ropes, and extremely unstable wooden platforms. And if you shared a drink under the same sheaf of wheat 3 times, well, local legend said you were basically married, or cursed, or both. At these events, status lines blurred. A knight might share cider with a butcher's daughter. A merchant's apprentice might fall for a shoemaker's son. Even clergy would turn up officially to bless the feast, but often to sneak a honey cake and dance when no one was watching. And though formal courtship rules didn't disappear, they were temporarily misplaced. Costumes helped too. On certain feast days, participants wore masks or swapped clothes with others. The Feast of Fools and carnivalesque events allowed people to step outside their roles. A servant might dress as a queen, a monk as a farmer. It was chaotic silly and allowed people to say things they normally couldn't. Like, I like you, or would you like to share this roast apple and maybe all your future roasts too? Historians still argue whether these festivals were tolerated exceptions to social rigidity or deeply subversive rituals where the usual hierarchies crumbled. Either way, people used them. Carefully, cunningly, often after 3 mugs of ale. You'd also find love games at these events, singing duels, storytelling contests, even riddling competitions. A popular pastime involved 2 people tossing lines of rhyme back and forth, trying to outwit each other with compliments or innuendo. One surviving fragment reads, "Your hair is like wheat, but your tongue is sharper than my scythe." To which the reply was, "At least my wit cuts better than your harvest." Ah, romance. Even the food had signals. Offering someone a honey tart could suggest sweetness or, if homemade, deeper affection. Sharing meat was more intimate. Bread casual. Cheese. Well, that depended on the cheese. Some were strong enough to end a marriage, let alone start one. Of course, not all festival courtships ended in joy. You might flirt with someone only to discover they were already betrothed or related, or just visiting from another village and due to leave before sunset. Or perhaps they disappeared halfway through the Morris dancing, never to be seen again. You'd wait under the willow tree clutching a wilted posy while someone else sang a bawdy ballad nearby. Still, you wouldn't trade the memory, because that one glance that shared danced that moment where you both reached for the same baked pear that was yours. Brief, maybe, but real. And while village elders tisked and muttered about youth these days, the festivals continued. Every year, with new faces, new glances, new ribbons dropped accidentally in front of the cider press. So tonight, as your mind drifts through soft music and flickering torchlight, imagine yourself beneath the maypole. Your hands are warm, your heart hopeful, and somewhere in the crowd someone is already watching you, perhaps carrying a goose, but still. Love finds a way. You slide behind a wooden cart, heart-pounding ears tuned for any footsteps on gravel. The moon is high, silvering the stone walls of the manor behind you. A soft whinny from the stable. A rustle near the orchard. And then you see them, cloaked careful with a bundle under one arm and a candle stub in the other. You grin. Tonight you're sneaking out to meet someone you shouldn't, because this is forbidden love and your rendezvous spot. Somewhere between the root cellar and eternal damnation. Not every medieval romance was blessed by priests or sanctioned by elders. Some were secret scandalous or outright dangerous. Lovers caught between class divides, political rivalries, family feuds, or more often than you'd think, literal castle walls. Let's start with cloistered romances, those that bloomed within or adjacent to the church. Maybe you were a lady promised to the veil but found yourself exchanging glances with the new kitchen boy. Or perhaps you were a page at a bishop's court, suddenly enamored with a nun whose Latin was better than yours. These liaisons were risky. If discovered, the punishment ranged from penance and public shame to full-on expulsion. But that didn't stop them. Hidden notes tucked into hymnals, stolen touches during vespers, the occasional tryst behind a curtain thick with dust and guilt. There's a documented case of two young novices in 14th century France who passed love poems in the margins of their psalters. They wrote in rebus little pictures to disguise their words. One poem ends with a doodle of a cat, a heart, and a ladder. Interpretations vary. The abbot did not find it charming. Then there were class-crossing romances. A noble might fall for a stable boy. A kitchen maid might capture the attention of a visiting knight. These weren't just frowned upon, they could lead to legal consequences. Some manors had explicit rules forbidding interaction between servants and the elite. A violation could cost someone their position or worse, their reputation. Yet the stories persisted. There's a folk song from Cornwall about a miller's daughter and a baron's son who met by the riverbank when the moon cast no judgment. Poetic, and probably muddy. In urban settings, forbidden love often took the form of guild drama. Imagine falling for someone from a rival trade, say you're a weaver and they're a dyer. Your families have argued about thread pricing for decades, and now you're sneaking kisses behind bolts of wool. It sounds absurd, but these tensions were real. Guild rivalries could be fierce, and marrying outside your trade could mean social exile. And yet people did it anyway, quietly, stubbornly, because love doesn't care about the cost of flax. Now let's climb a tower, literally. Lovers in castles had their own set of challenges. Noble daughters were often kept under lock and key, both metaphorically and occasionally very literally. Young women were sometimes betrothed as political pawns, their affections dismissed as irrelevant. But behind tapestries and through hidden corridors, romances kindled. One 15th century letter from a knight to a noblewoman reads, "Though I may not wear your ribbon in the lists, I wear your name in my chest," which is either very sweet or deeply anatomical. You might even find yourself orchestrating an escape. A rope of knotted bedsheets, a signal with a candle in the window, a midnight ride on a borrowed horse. One famous tale tells of a merchant's daughter who lowered herself out of a tower window to meet her lover, a stonemason she'd watched working on the cathedral. She broke her ankle on the landing. They married anyway. And their children all became glaziers, a happy ending with sore feet. Of course, family feuds played their part too. Echoes of Romeo and Juliet rang through countless medieval villages long before Shakespeare wrote them down. In Italy, the Montecchi and Capuletti were real families. In England, dozens of county squabbles turned romantic crossfire. A youth from one hamlet meets a girl from another, their parents hiss and mutter, and suddenly the entire town is taking sides over stolen glances at the grain market. Sometimes these stories ended in reconciliation. Sometimes not. One German chronicle describes a feud that began with a love match and ended in a 12-year sausage embargo between two towns. Tragic and deeply inconvenient. Historians still argue whether these forbidden romances were as common as the songs suggest, or just idealized narratives passed down for entertainment. But there's enough parchment, enough marginalia, enough scandal-soaked Sermon notes to suggest they happened. A lot, and people remembered. They remembered the thrill of sneaking into a barn after curfew, the adrenaline of a shared glance in a crowded chapel, the danger of a letter folded too hastily smudged with nervous hands, and the heartbreak too the times someone didn't show up, the times they were discovered, the times it ended before it ever began. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine it, cool stone under your feet, a flickering torch in the distance, the weight of silence pressing close. And somewhere in the dark, someone waiting for you with the single candle, a soft whisper, and the quiet defiance of love that refuses to be told no. A lute plucks softly in the courtyard. You're seated on a low stone wall watching a man in an embroidered tunic struggle to hit a high note without sounding like a startled goose. He's beneath your window. There are roses on the ground. A small terrified dog at his feet. He sings on undeterred. This is courtly love, and it's equal parts performance poetry and polite emotional suffering. Unlike peasant flirtation, which happened between shovels and cider mugs, courtly love was an elite affair. Not only was it usually chaste, it was also often hopeless. That was the point. It wasn't necessarily about marriage or consummation. It was about longing, endless, noble, often impractical longing. The idea took hold in the 12th century southern France and quickly swept through European courts. Influenced by troubadour poetry, the love between a knight and a noblewoman, usually already married, was seen as refining, ennobling, even spiritual. The suffering of the lover expressed in elaborate verse elevated him morally. Which sounds poetic until you realize most of these knights spent more time sighing than sword fighting. You, dear dreamer, might find yourself the object of one such devotion. A knight sees you at a feast, drops his goblet, and spends the next 3 years composing odes to your forehead. He cannot speak to you, of course. That would be improper. Instead, he names his horse after you, or his sword, or his recurring fever. Troubadours gave voice to these passions. They wrote songs filled with metaphors from soaring falcons to wilting violets. One 13th century ballad reads, "Her smile is like spring rain, and I am but dry moss." Romantic, damp, slightly fungal. The language was formulaic, comparing the beloved to celestial objects, describing emotional torment, and usually slipping in a stanza about the cruel impossibility of their union. Historians still argue whether courtly love was truly felt or simply performed. Was it sincere or just a way for nobles to flex their poetic muscles between jousts? Some say it offered a safe outlet for otherwise dangerous desires. Others claim it was the medieval equivalent of friend zoning with extra embroidery. But it wasn't all harmless verse. These arrangements could have real emotional consequences. Letters from noble women occasionally reveal exhaustion, frustration, and a desire for less poetry and more practical partnership. One French countess wrote, "He speaks of dying for me again. I wish he would instead fetch firewood, efficient woman." At times, the boundaries of courtly love blurred. What began as chaste admiration sometimes tipped into clandestine affairs. Castles had nooks. Priests looked the other way, and not every husband was home from campaign. Courtly love was also a performance sport. Whole courts would gather to judge love debates where poets or nobles argued abstract romantic dilemmas. Can true love exist without jealousy? Is it nobler to suffer unspoken love or to declare it and risk rejection? The debates were staged dramatic and probably involved at least one dramatic fainting. Women weren't always passive in this game. Noble women often participated, choosing which suitors received a token, composing poems of their own, or rejecting clumsy efforts with spectacular flair. There's a story of a lady who returned a poorly written love ballad by correcting its grammar in red ink and sending it back. Brutal, iconic. These courtly ideals filtered down too. Even lesser nobles and merchants began mimicking the style. You might find an apprentice writing tortured rhymes to the baker's daughter, quoting phrases he'd overheard from a visiting minstrel. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes she married a miller instead. Of course, if you were poor, courtly love was more fantasy than reality. But even among the working classes, echoes of it emerged. You might call someone your son or your lady dove. You might hum a tune that borrowed its melody from a noble ballad, even if the words were more about cheese than chastity. And let's not forget the props. Tokens of love were everywhere. Gloves, ribbons, brooches, each infused with meaning. A lady's favor worn into battle was believed to bring luck, or distraction, or both. There's a documented case of a knight so preoccupied with holding his beloved's scarf that he forgot to lower his visor. He survived. Barely. The scarf did not. Yet, for all its rituals and rehearsals, courtly love gave people something powerful: a language. A script for feeling things in a time when marriage was mostly economic and emotions were tightly controlled. It allowed people, especially women, to exist as subjects of admiration rather than just objects of alliance, even if that admiration came with 47 verses and questionable rhyme schemes. So tonight, imagine the flicker of torchlight on stone walls, the rustle of silk, the hush before the music starts. Somewhere, a knight waits his heart full of awkward sonnets, his tunic pressed, his dog confused. And high above at your window you watch and wonder, will he rhyme moon with soon again? Yes. Yes, he will. You wake up in a cart. It's moving. You're wrapped in a wool blanket, someone's tunic is covering your face, and your left shoe is missing. Also, you may have just been kidnapped by your future husband. Welcome to the strange, alarming, and occasionally normalized tradition of marriage by abduction, a medieval custom that somehow combined romance strategy and lightly bruised ankles. Now don't panic. You probably agreed to this. Probably. In some parts of medieval Europe, especially in certain Celtic and Slavic regions, bride capture wasn't always a crime. It could be part of the marriage process. In its mildest form, it was symbolic. The groom and his friends would steal the bride from her family during a festive reenactment, complete with staged resistance, laughter, and celebratory mead. Think of it as theater, with livestock watching. But sometimes it wasn't symbolic at all. A suitor blocked by the bride's parents or lacking the means to pay a dowry might simply take matters into his own hands. Literally. He'd gather a few loyal companions, preferably ones with horses and strong opinions, and whisk the young woman away, either to a safe house or to a neighboring village sympathetic to impulsive nuptials. Historians still argue whether this was more often consensual or coercive. The records are blurry. There are documented cases of women later defending their abductors, claiming they had conspired together to escape parental control. Other times it's pretty clear the bride was less than thrilled, especially if she was dragged out of a feast in front of everyone still holding a drumstick. In some regions, particularly early medieval Ireland and parts of Central Asia, these elopements could trigger legal obligations. Once the couple had spent a night together, even platonically, custom dictated that marriage was all but official. Families might negotiate after the fact, smoothing things over with exchanged livestock, an apology ham, or in extreme cases, a minor war. Even among the nobility, forms of this existed. A minor nobleman might rescue a lady from an unwanted engagement by staging a dramatic abduction, often with her full cooperation. She'd scream. He'd carry her to a horse. The steward would faint. very theatrical. They'd be married within the week, but not every capture was romantic. Some were exploitative, especially when younger or orphaned women were targeted for their inheritance. Wealthy widows too were at risk. Abduction in these cases was often a way to gain control of their estates. In 14th century England, one such widow was kidnapped, married against her will, and only freed after the local bishop intervened with armed clerics. Which is not something you hear everyday armed clerics. The church, for its part, was deeply conflicted. Canon law stressed free consent in marriage, which technically made forced abduction invalid. But proving lack of consent, that was a mess of he said, she said, especially when the couple reappeared. Married, apologetic, and suddenly very interested in combining vineyards. To make things even more confusing, some abduction cases became love stories, at least according to the ballads. There's a famous Breton tune about a girl taken from her father's house at midnight by a soldier, only to fall in love with him on the road. They married under an oak tree with owls as witnesses. Real, who knows? But someone carved their initials into that tree, and that counts for something. And then there's the legal gray zone of mock abductions. In these, a willing couple would stage a kidnapping to escape disapproving parents or avoid paying fees to the local lord. By pretending it was accidental, they could bypass fines tolls or the infamously awkward public betrothal feast, which sometimes involved mimes. Not all cultures treated it the same way. In parts of the Balkans, arranged bride abductions lingered well into the early modern era. Meanwhile, in Norman England, forced marriage after abduction was specifically outlawed in some charters, as in "Please stop kidnapping our daughters during harvest season. We are very tired." There's even evidence of reverse abductions where a bold woman took matters into her own hands. One 13th century account from Bavaria describes a young noblewoman who kidnapped her suitor after his father forbade their union. She locked him in a tower room with food candles and a lute. He proposed 2 days later, possibly from fear, possibly from romance. Historians remain divided. So tonight, as you lie still beneath your blanket, imagine the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone, the wind in your hair, the laughter or not of companions determined to change your fate. Maybe you agreed. Maybe you didn't. Maybe it's all a story sung by firelight to scandalized grandchildren. Either way, in the medieval world, love sometimes knocked. And sometimes it climbed through your window and took you for a ride. You're standing in the town square, heart in your throat, surrounded by at least 30 people, many of whom are staring pointedly at your shoes for reasons you don't understand yet. There's music and someone's waving a banner. It looks festive, but this is no ordinary celebration. This is your wedding, and like it or not, it's very public. Because in medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just about two people, it was about everyone else's business too. Let's begin with the public declaration. Before most marriages could happen, they had to be announced loudly, clearly, and repeatedly. This was called the crying of the banns, and it involved your names being read aloud in church on 3 consecutive Sundays. The idea was to give anyone with an objection time to step forward. Just in case one of you was already married. Or a known sheep thief, or both. If no one objected, or at least no one loud enough, you'd proceed to the ceremony. But this wasn't always a quiet, candlelit affair. Especially among common folk, a wedding was a public performance, and much of it took place outdoors in the churchyard at the village cross, or right in the street. It wasn't unusual for passers-by to join in whether they were invited or not. Then came the proof, because apparently vows weren't enough. In some parts of Europe, newlyweds were subject to bedding ceremonies, elaborate traditions where the couple was escorted to the marriage bed by a group of enthusiastic relatives, friends, and local busybodies. They didn't just tuck you in, they sang songs, made bawdy jokes, and sometimes even threw grain or rose petals on the bed. Romantic, if you like an audience. And if you think that's awkward, just wait. In certain places, especially parts of France and Germany, the community expected evidence of consummation. This could mean anything from blood-stained sheets to testimony from witnesses. Yes, that's right. There were situations where a servant priest or elder might linger near the door, accidentally hearing enough to confirm the union was sealed. Some nobles even made it official by displaying the linens the next morning. Nothing like airing your business literally on the line outside your window. Historians still argue whether these bedding rituals were more symbolic than voyeuristic. Many believe they began as fertility rites or community blessings, gradually becoming social theater. Others suggest it was all about property, ensuring the marriage was legally and physically binding, especially when land or titles were at stake. Even among peasants, a wedding wasn't complete without witnesses dancing and frequently a parade through town. Drums, lutes, children throwing crumbs, chickens tied with ribbons. It wasn't just about love, it was about spectacle legitimacy, and reminding everyone that two households had just become one for better or for comedic storytelling. And oh, the traditions. In some English villages, newlyweds had to leap over a broom, a bench, or even a ditch, symbolizing the leap into married life. In parts of Italy, brides cracked a nut underfoot to ensure fertility. In Scotland, there was blackening the bride, where friends and relatives smeared the bride and groom with ash feathers and molasses, then paraded them through the streets. Again, very romantic, very sticky. But perhaps the most telling part of all this public ritual was what came after the social monitoring. A newly married couple was watched closely by their neighbors. Was the husband respectful? Did the wife seem content? Were there signs of pregnancy within the year? Gossip could make or break reputations, and a failed marriage might mean social fallout not just for the couple, but their families as well. Which is why in some communities, people faked it. A couple might pretend they'd consummated the marriage using chicken blood or clever storytelling, especially if something had gone wrong. Nerves disagreements, or simple bad luck. There's one record from Normandy of a groom who tripped, panicked, and ran out the door before completing his duty. His bride calmly shredded an old sheet, added a smear of jam, and flung it out the window at dawn. He returned 2 days later, flowers in hand. Let's also not forget the pressure on heirs. Among nobles producing children, preferably male ones, was the entire point of the union. The whole community was invested in your fertility. Some even held blessing ceremonies over the marriage bed, complete with relics, charms, and awkward chanting. Imagine trying to relax with Aunt Mildred waving incense around your head. And yet amid all the performance, many couples did fall in love. The public pressure gave way to private tenderness. They'd share stories, chores, laughs. They'd figure it out, or not. But they'd do it together with half the village watching whether they liked it or not. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, picture yourself in a candlelit room, the echoes of lutes and laughter fading through the shutters. There's a ring on your hand, a flower in your hair, and quite possibly a stranger snoring outside your door, just making sure you're really married. The moon is high, casting silver over your little wooden chest, the one where you hide the dried herbs, the carved bone comb, and that slightly worrying frog. Tonight you light a beeswax candle, murmur a phrase you half remember from your aunt's whispered advice, and sprinkle time over a bit of linen. Because sometimes love needs a little help, or at least a nudge from something vaguely magical and questionably legal. Welcome to the world of medieval love charms and potions, where romance meets alchemy, folklore, and a healthy amount of superstition. If you're heartbroken, hopeful, or just plain desperate, this was the toolkit. Not everyone had access to troubadours or matchmaking priests, but you could find a wise woman at the edge of town who knew exactly how much vervain to crush for that special effect, or how to steep rose petals with just enough nutmeg to make someone dream of you for 3 nights straight. Allegedly, let's begin with the most popular potion-based herbs. Basil was said to attract affection. Dill could keep lovers faithful. Marjoram invited tenderness. And mint, of course, was for freshness, flattery, and breath-related emergencies. You'd grind these into a warm wine honey cake, or even a mild poultice to be worn close to the heart. Bonus points if you gathered them on a Friday under a waxing moon naked, preferably, though local law frowned upon that detail. Then there were the charms. Tiny tokens carved with symbols, hearts not circles. Some were worn on strings, others hidden in clothing. One 14th century manuscript details a charm involving a piece of parchment, inscribed with a combination of Latin, Hebrew, and what scholars call creative spelling. This charm was meant to be hidden under the mattress, hopefully not found by your mother-in-law. Animals too made an appearance. The humble frog, for example, was thought to have powerful love-inducing properties. A young woman might kiss a frog not for transformation, but because it was believed to soften the heart of a potential suitor. Did it work? Maybe. Did it give her a rash? Also maybe. One love charm from Saxony involved baking a cake containing the crushed shell of a robin's egg, marigold petals, and a lock of hair from the intended, of course. This cake was then buried under a threshold the target was expected to walk over. If they did, they'd fall helplessly in love. If they didn't, you'd have a cake buried in the mud. Which is tragic if nothing else. Another tactic, the sieve and shears ritual, where you balanced a pair of scissors on the rim of a flour sieve and asked a question aloud. The way it turned or didn't was said to reveal romantic truths. The logic of this escapes most modern minds. But to a medieval youth desperate to know if Thomas the stable boy liked them, it was practically gospel. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or fringe. Some see them as remnants of older pagan traditions. Others believe they were part of everyday folk magic tolerated so long as they didn't directly challenge the church. In fact, many spells included invocations of saints blending faith and folklore into one convenient and plausible package. But tread carefully, because love magic could land you in real trouble. The church viewed most charms as dangerously close to witchcraft, especially if they involved bodily fluids, which they often did, and which we will not describe in detail here. More than one woman was dragged before ecclesiastical courts for allegedly using enchanted tokens to trap a man. Some were fined, others were publicly shamed. One unlucky apothecary had all his romance powders seized and burned. He claimed they were for soup. No one believed him. No one. And while women were most often accused of using love magic, men dabbled too. A 13th century soldier confessed to wearing a linen scrap, soaked in his beloved's tears, believing it would make her think of him every night. Whether it worked or simply made his armpit smell sad is lost to time. There were also unloved charms used to break a romantic bond. A jealous suitor might scatter salt across a threshold, twist a ribbon counterclockwise, or place a mirror face down in the target's home. All were believed to dissolve affections or cause dreams of separation, which is awfully specific for someone just upset about a canceled betrothal. Despite the risks, these rituals persisted. They were private, personal, and offered a sense of control in a world where so much, especially marriage, was dictated by others. Through herbs and whispers, through knots and candle stubs, people tried to bend love to their will, even if only for a moment. So tonight, as the candlelight flickers and shadows shift on the wall, imagine your fingers wrapped around a warm cup of honeyed brew, steeped in rosemary and longing. Outside, the wind stirs the leaves. Inside, the air smells of lavender, thyme, and hope. You may not believe in magic, but sometimes just believing in something is enough. The sun slips behind the hills as you stand quietly in the churchyard, fiddling with the edge of your sleeve, listening to bells that seem louder than usual. Tomorrow is your wedding, or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just another meeting with a family friend arranged behind closed doors with an eye on your virginity, your virtue, and your value. Not necessarily in that order. Because tonight you live in a world where virginity, vows, and virtue aren't just ideals, they're a medieval obsession, especially if you're a woman. In the Middle Ages, the concept of virginity was tied not simply to chastity, but to identity. A noblewoman's virginity was considered part of her dowry and invisible currency, more powerful than a bag of silver or three well-behaved oxen. Its presence or absence could impact her marriageability, her inheritance, even her safety. Of course, proving it was another matter entirely. Enter the chastity belt, a legendary item said to be used by suspicious husbands or controlling fathers. Historians now believe most of these were either metaphorical or invented later as jokes or fear-mongering illustrations. Actual medieval chastity belts made of iron and worn for long periods would have caused horrific health problems. The surviving examples were likely theatrical props or museum fakes. Still, the idea persisted, fed by a culture anxious about women's bodies and intensely invested in policing their choices. More common were bridal tokens, sashes, veils, or even little pouches sewn into a bride's gown symbolizing purity. In some cases, a priest would bless the garment. In others, a mother or aunt would simply whisper instructions, hand over a belt or a charm, and remind the bride, "You must remain unopened like a holy book." No pressure then. And what if you didn't? What if you'd fallen in love already or made a mistake or simply didn't fit the mold? Well, it depends. Some women sought spiritual loopholes. You could take a vow of chastity and become a bride of Christ. You might enter a convent or join a Began community, informal religious sisterhoods, where women lived piously without taking full monastic vows. These communities were rare safe havens where unmarried women could escape the social pressure to wed while still retaining dignity and some degree of freedom. For men, virginity was optional, ideal perhaps in specific religious orders or holy stories, but rarely enforced outside of those. A nobleman could have a youthful affair, a handful of tavern flings, even an illegitimate child or two, and still be seen as a good match. If anything, such experience might add to his allure. He knows the ways of the world, someone might say, ignoring the ways of the laundress entirely. Women, not so much. If a woman was known or rumored to have lost her virginity, her prospect shrank faster than a poorly dried tunic. She might still marry, but not well. She might be sent away to relatives. In some cases, she'd be publicly shamed, forced to confess before a priest, a council, or worse, her neighbors. One 14th century record from a town in Burgundy details a case where a young woman falsely accused of premarital relations was made to parade barefoot through the streets carrying a candle as tall as she was. Her family insisted on her innocence. The accuser, as it turned out, had mistaken her for someone else entirely. The candle weighed 7 pounds. Still, not every community enforced these ideals with equal severity. Some townsfolk turned blind eyes. Others shrugged, especially when the couple in question had obvious affection, or when a baby arrived suspiciously early, but everyone agreed not to do the math. Marriage vows, when taken, were binding, and spiritual a sacrament according to church doctrine from the 12th century onward. By then, the church had established that a valid marriage required mutual consent said aloud, preferably in public. Interestingly, this meant that two people could technically marry each other without clergy, just by exchanging vows in front of witnesses. Convenient, also chaotic. Still, most marriages followed custom. You'd recite your vows at the church door or inside the nave, promising faithfulness and service. Love wasn't necessarily part of the script. In fact, some older rituals sounded more like contracts. One version reads, "With this body I thee worship," which is poetic until you remember. Worship also meant honor like a contractually obligated landlord. Some couples managed to twist the tradition to suit their bond. They added gestures, secret squeezes, shared glances, even jokes. One well-loved tale from England tells of a bride who deliberately flubbed her vow just to make her new husband blush. She said, "To have and to hold until he learns to make a decent broth." The priest laughed so hard he dropped the ring. Historians still argue whether medieval society truly believed in idealized purity or just enforced it because it gave structure to chaos. Perhaps both. Virginity was often less about personal piety and more about control of land lineage's legitimacy. And yet, between the rules, people lived, loved, lied a little, found loopholes, fumbled through. So tonight, imagine yourself cloaked in velvet or rough-spun linen, a sash tied at your waist, the echo of bells in the distance. You carry within you secret story scars. Maybe you're untouched, maybe you're not. Maybe you're something in between like most people most of the time. But in the dark beneath the stars, there is no test, no proof, no candle-heavy parades. There's just you and your quiet vow to be loved as you are. You slip into the back of the chapel just as the chanting begins. The air is thick with incense and unspoken secrets. Robes shuffle, candles flicker, and there, 3 pews ahead, a monk lowers his hood and glances toward the choir loft. You follow his gaze. A nun pale and still holds a hymn book she hasn't turned a page in for 10 minutes. Ah, so that's happening. Yes, tonight. You're stepping into the cloistered corridors of clergy and love, a world of forbidden glances, stolen letters, and hearts that refuse to obey vows even when those vows came dressed in cassocks and veils. By the high Middle Ages, official church policy was clear: clergy were expected to remain celibate. Monks, nuns, priests, no marriages, no children, no romantic entanglements. In theory, their devotion was entirely spiritual. In practice, let's just say the rules were selectively observed. It hadn't always been that way. Earlier in the medieval period, many priests were married. Even popes had children. But beginning in the 11th century, the Gregorian reform movement pushed for strict celibacy. Bishops cracked down. Decrees were issued. Synods met scolded and sometimes shouted. And yet the heart is a reckless organ. In monastic communities where men and women lived separately, you might think love would be easy to avoid. But these places weren't fortresses. Monasteries often had guest houses, kitchens, staffed by lay people, messengers coming and going. There were shared libraries, medical gardens, scriptoriums, and sometimes the walls were literally next to each other, separated only by a gate or a bit of stone or a very climbable hedge. Letters were passed, songs exchanged. Candles burned long into the night over poems copied from memory. In one famous 12th century case, a monk composed a series of acrostic verses for a nun, each first letter spelling out her name. She replied with her own acrostics. The affair lasted 5 years. The scandal lasted 10. Historians still argue whether these romantic entanglements were spiritual friendships that blurred boundaries or genuine physical love affairs? Probably both. Some relationships involved deep emotional intimacy without ever crossing into the physical. Others did not remain so metaphorical. Take the infamous case of Abelard and Eloise, two of the Middle Ages' most famous lovers. Abelard was a philosopher and tutor, Heloise his brilliant student. Their love was passionate, forbidden, and thoroughly documented. When Eloise became pregnant, Abelard arranged a secret marriage. It didn't stay secret. Her family was furious. Abelard was attacked and forcibly castrated. Both later entered religious life, he a monk, she a nun, and wrote letters to each other for years. Letters full of longing, philosophy, and occasionally veiled bitterness. Even outside romantic relationships, medieval clergy struggled with the ideal of chastity. Diaries, confessions, and even court records reveal a quiet undercurrent of tension priests, torn between their vows and their desires. Some had long-term lovers they supported discreetly. Others tried and failed to suppress their feelings, confessing them in carefully coded terms. And then there were the clerical housekeepers. These women, sometimes called mulieres religiosas, were officially there to clean, cook, and manage the household. Unofficially, many were romantic partners, some even raising children with the priest. The church condemned the practice repeatedly, but like a garden weed, it kept returning. Monastic love also appeared in literature, though often disguised. Medieval romances featured cloistered lovers longing monks, or mysterious nuns with sorrowful eyes. One tale tells of a nun who carves the initials of her beloved into a candle, then melts it nightly while praying for his safety. In the end, she joins him not in marriage, but as a disguised pilgrim on a ship bound for the Holy Land. Not all stories ended in tragedy. Some lovers quietly stepped away from religious life, renouncing vows in favor of family and freedom. Others stayed carrying their devotion like a secret psalm, hidden humming beneath every prayer. Of course, the church tried to root out these passions. Inquisitions investigated rumors. Bishops issued threats. Monastic rules were rewritten with increasing detail, some hilariously specific. Monks must not linger near the nunnery herb garden without supervision, and yet the architecture of desire found its way through cloister walls. A shared book left open to a certain page. A song hummed just off key. A glance across a candle-lit hallway. These were the doorways through which love entered even when every other door was locked. So tonight, imagine the hush of a stone corridor. Your bare feet whisper across flagstones. The air smells of wax, old parchment, and pressed violets. Somewhere someone kneels in prayer, and someone else remembers the warmth of their hand. Vows may bind, but they don't silence. Not always. And in the hush of the chapel, under the gaze of saints and shadows, a candle flickers. And no one looks away. The bell tolls again, low, slow, and distant, echoing across fields now strangely empty. The streets, too, are quiet. A bundle of rosemary lies untouched on a doorstep. You pull your cloak tighter as you pass shuttered homes and notice a red X scrawled on a wooden door. You don't knock. You walk faster. Because today is not like other days. And fallen in love during the plague. Well, that's a gamble of the highest order. It's the 14th century, and Europe is deep in the grip of the Black Death. The rules of daily life have collapsed, and so have the rules of courtship. When half your village is gone and the churchyard is full, a love story becomes both more urgent and more uncertain. Under these conditions, dating changes. Fast. You no longer wait 3 feast days to share a glance or worry about whether your embroidered ribbon sends the wrong message. You speak plainly, you say what you feel. because you've seen how fast everything can vanish. And strangely, amid all this death, there's love. People fall for each other in quarantined homes across plague trenches through prayer and panic. Some even fall in love because of the plague, a kind of rebellion against despair. If the world is ending, you might as well kiss someone before it does. Yet finding a partner wasn't simple. Public gatherings were dangerous, and churches often restricted weddings. Mass celebrations were banned, so couples met in strange, improvised ways through food deliveries, chance roadside encounters, or whispered conversations across windows. One surviving letter from 1349 describes a young man proposing marriage by tossing a note wrapped around a clove of garlic through a second-story window. She accepted. They were wed by a priest in masks. The plague changed what people valued in a partner, too. Wealth lost its glow when the rich died, just as fast as the poor. Strength of character, gentleness, and even shared sense of humor took precedence. What mattered was survival and someone to hold your hand while you tried. Many lovers eloped their weddings stripped of all pageantry. A priest, two witnesses, and a chapel that smelled of damp stone and clove smoke. No feast, no dancing. Just a quiet promise, sometimes spoken through cloth veils, sometimes through tears. Historians still argue whether the plague caused a rise or fall in marriage rates. Some claim a surge in hurried unions, people marrying out of fear or to secure inheritance rights. Others argue that marriage plummeted as families collapsed and communities isolated. The truth. Likely both, depending on where and when. In Florence, marriage registrations nearly stopped. In rural England, they spiked. Love, it turns out, is strangely regional even during a pandemic, but the plague also exposed the limits of love. Couples were separated by quarantines, sometimes indefinitely. Travel bans made it impossible to reunite. Letters, if they arrived at all, came weeks late and smelled faintly of vinegar, a poor man's disinfectant. And yet, they persisted. One nun wrote to her beloved, an apothecary's apprentice, every week during lockdown. Her letters survived. His sadly did not. But she copied his words in the margins of her psalter. "Your voice is my medicine," one reads. "No balm but your breath." Dramatic, yes, but also sort of accurate. Some lovers turned to rituals and charms not just for affection, but for protection. They sewed talismans into cloaks, shared amulets, recited the same psalm at the same time each day, believing that synchronized prayer might link their fates. One young woman kept a clove of her sweetheart's hair in a pouch of sage, swearing it warded off both rats and loneliness. Of course, some relationships didn't survive. Illness separated lovers. Grief overwhelmed desire. One heartbroken shepherd carved his beloved's name into a plague stone, a boundary marker for infected zones. He added, "She did not wait," a line that says everything and nothing. And then there were the healers, those rare couples drawn together by shared purpose. Apothecaries and midwives, monks and nurses, burying the dead by day, holding each other by night. Their love stories rarely made the songs, but they mattered. They were quiet, steadfast, and surrounded by sorrow, which made every smile between them feel like a miracle. The plague also shifted gender roles temporarily. With men dying in large numbers, women took on new roles, including choosing partners or managing estates. For some, this meant a brief window of autonomy. One widow, after losing 2 husbands to the plague, refused all new suitors. "My hands are full," she wrote, "with ghosts and goats. Understandable. So tonight, as you curl beneath your blanket, imagine it a candle flickering in a shuttered window, a voice singing softly down an empty street. two hands meeting not out of courtly tradition, but sheer need. The world trembles, the bells toll, and yet, even in a time of death, you reach for someone. Because love, inconvenient as ever, doesn't know when to quit. The parchment feels smooth under your fingers, the ink still faintly scented with rosewater. It's folded precisely tucked into the spine of a psalm book, slipped there when no one was looking. You unfold it carefully, heart-thudding, and read, "To thee, my sister, in God, but more in heart." You know the hand that wrote it, and you know what it means. Tonight, you are stepping into the quiet, layered world of same-sex love in medieval times, and more specifically, the hidden, coded realm of lesbian love and desire, a world too often erased yet always there between the lines. In an age when marriage was largely transactional and dictated by gendered duty, what happened once woman loved another woman? Sometimes nothing visible, and sometimes everything. Women in the Middle Ages lived close together in deeply intimate settings, convents, households, guild halls, and shared apprenticeships. They bathed together, slept in communal spaces, cared for each other, and raised children as godparents or midwives. This closeness created deep emotional bonds which could sometimes become romantic or even physical. But labeling these relationships as lesbian in the modern sense is tricky. Historians still argue whether emotional female friendships were romantic platonic or intentionally ambiguous. The language was poetic, not clinical. A woman might call another her beloved soul, life companion, or my mirror in joy and sorrow. Intimate, yes. Definitively romantic. It depends who you ask and which bishop is listening. Take the Beguines' semi-religious communities of women who lived together without taking formal vows. Some shared homes, finances, and lives for decades. They were respected, sometimes suspected frequently, and often left very few personal records behind. But when we do find their letters or wills, we see quiet declarations to my companion, all that I have. Let her remain with me and I with her until death. In some convents, strong emotional bonds flourished. There are preserved notes from a 15th century German abbey where one nun writes to another, "When I saw thee at the altar, my breath did halt. My soul quakes like the flame before God's face." That's a lot for someone you're just sharing lentils with. There were also accusations usually made by outsiders. Church officials occasionally raided convents suspected of immodest behavior. Punishments ranged from reassignment to public penance. One 14th century record details two women sentenced to fast on bread and water for sharing a bed in unholy intimacy. Another case from Italy mentions acts against nature performed in a textile workshop, though the Latin is fuzzy, and the margin contains a doodle of a confused-looking sheep. But not every same-sex relationship was discovered or punished or even noticed. Many simply continued in private, disguised by custom, protected by community, or ignored by those who had other things to worry about like taxes or boiling plagues. And let's not pretend this was limited to cloisters. In towns and villages, women formed deep partnerships, especially widows and unmarried women who lived together by necessity or choice. They farmed, kept house, raised each other's children, and shared every aspect of life. One pair from a Flemish village were buried side by side with matching headstones. Their joint epitaph reads, "In joy and labor, always two." No husband is mentioned, just each other. Of course, church law condemned same-sex acts, especially those involving physical contact. The penitential's medieval handbooks for confessors prescribed harsh penance for women who lay together as man and wife. But these rules were often inconsistently applied, rarely enforced, and wrapped in vague euphemism. And many people simply didn't confess. Instead, they coded a carved heart with two needles through it, a poem left unsigned, a gesture that meant I remember. Love could live in the margins, in the silences, in the way one woman carried the other's shoes home from the market. Modern scholars search for evidence in court records, grave sites, and snippets of verse, piecing together a puzzle from threads that were never meant to be seen. And yet, the stories are there. They flicker quietly like a lantern kept behind a curtain. Sometimes love left physical traces. A braided cord passed down. A book annotated by two hands. A gown made with extra care. In one London archive, a scribe's manual contains a faint, ink-blotted line. Her eyes undid me. No name, no context, just that. Tonight, as the wind rattles the shutters and you press deeper into your blanket, imagine two women walking side by side through frost-covered fields. They don't speak. They don't need to. One hands the other a sprig of rosemary, a promise, a memory, a vow no law can touch. Because even in a world of silence and rules and hiding hearts still found each other and held on. You step over the worn threshold of a spice merchant's house, the scent of cinnamon and dust rising as a soft breeze slips in behind you. A young man offers you a cup of warm wine, sweet, slightly spiced, just unfamiliar enough to make you wonder where he's really from. He laughs at your curiosity. Aleppo, he says, but my mother is from Cordoba, and just like that, your world. Your very small, heavily fenced, rule-soaked world gets a little wider. Because now you've wandered into one of the most complicated corners of medieval romance. Interfaith love, particularly between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, in a world often set up to keep them apart. And yet love doesn't really care about statutes, sermons, or city walls. It shows up anyway. In multicultural cities like Toledo, Palermo, Constantinople, or parts of the Crusader states, communities of different faiths coexisted sometimes in peace, sometimes not. But where trade and learning flowed, so did human contact. And when people meet, talk, argue, teach, sometimes they fall for each other, even when they're not supposed to. In many Christian kingdoms, interfaith marriage was discouraged or outright banned. The church often forbade unions between Christians and Jews or Muslims, citing concerns over religious purity, inheritance, and, let's be honest, control. Mixed marriages threatened the clean categories officials like to keep. But that didn't stop them from happening. Sometimes the relationships were quiet, long-term partnerships that never made it to church or mosque but lasted nonetheless. A Christian cloth merchant and a Jewish seamstress who worked together, shared meals, shared laughter, eventually shared a home. A Muslim spice trader and a Christian widow who exchanged letters over years of travel, always signing them with symbols instead of names. One 12th century document from Sicily records a Christian woman who left her entire estate to her companion Yusuf, a Muslim gardener. He received her beeswax candles, her olive press, and the cat. Historians still argue whether they were lovers or simply friends. But someone wrote in love and truth beside their names, and that counts. In other places, conversion complicated matters. If a Jew converted to Christianity, often under duress or social pressure, marriage might become acceptable, though the community of origin might disown them. In some cases, couples chose exile over separation. Others simply lived in limbo, neither married nor free, tied only by affection and a series of small, brave decisions. One surviving letter from 14th century Provence tells of a young Christian man who fell for a Jewish woman named Miriam. He converted not from deep theological conviction, but as he wrote, because my heart chose her first. His baptismal sponsor later admitted he seemed very distracted during the rite. Understandably so. Meanwhile, in parts of Al-Andalus Muslim Spain, interfaith love had its own complexities. Muslim men could, under Islamic law, marry Christian or Jewish women. People of the book, but Muslim women were generally forbidden to marry outside the faith. Despite this, stories circulated of Muslim women who did fall in love with Christian men, especially scholars, physicians, or diplomats, often resulting in scandal poetry or both. One famous Andalusian poem speaks of her prayers in one direction, his in another, yet their hearts always met at dawn. Romantic. And quite possibly the reason someone lost a job in the caliph's library. These relationships weren't always hidden. In port cities, love crossed lines daily through trade language lessons, shared music. A Christian girl might hear an oud being played in the market and linger too long. A Jewish scholar might teach Arabic to a Christian nobleman's daughter. And one too many examples involve metaphors about birds nesting in foreign trees. And yet for every whispered meeting in a spice-scented courtyard, there was also danger. Being discovered could mean arrest, exile, or even death. Religious authorities were deeply uneasy about mixed unions. In some places, neighbors reported suspected relationships out of fear, spite, or religious fervor. Inquisition records from Spain detail such accusations, many unproven, all tense. Still, people found ways to protect what they could. One couple communicated through herb bundles, basil for love, rue for regret, marjoram for patience. Another used shared books, writing in margins, trading volumes in markets pretending they were just discussing theology. One Jewish-Christian pair carved matching symbols into the soles of their shoes. No one else knew, they did. Historians still debate how common these relationships were. Some argue they were rare exceptions. Others believe they were more frequent, but unrecorded, lost to time, burned in censors' fires, or buried in unmarked graves. But even a few surviving letters, names, and poems tell us they happened. Often quietly, always boldly. So tonight, imagine two lovers sitting beneath a fig tree sharing a bowl of dates, and a conversation half in Latin, half in Arabic, all in laughter. The world tells them no, the stars say otherwise. And even if history forgets their names for one night, they are simply together. The tavern door creaks open and in walks a woman draped in deep green wool, a scar running across one eyebrow and a basket slung over her arm. You recognize her instantly. Not because she's beautiful, though she is in that unbothered, sun-browned, permanently in charge sort of way, but because everyone calls her twice-widowed Matilda. And she is at this very moment writing her 5th love letter, with absolutely no shame. Tonight, you're in the company of the widows, the second chances, and the scandalously free, where love doesn't end when the priest says till death, but rather sometimes just hits the reset button. Medieval society had very clear ideas about when, how, and if you could love again. And being widowed, especially as a woman, came with all sorts of baggage, legal, financial, social, and deeply embroidered. But first, let's bust a myth. Not all widows were sad, frail, black-veiled figures clutching rosaries and staring wistfully into the fire. Some were. Others managed farms, negotiated property rights, ran taverns, and fended off suitors with a broom handle. Widows were, in many cases, the only women legally allowed to own land conduct business and make marriage decisions without male oversight, which meant they were also some of the only women who could choose to marry again or not. And many did. For love. For convenience. For the fact that winters or long fireplaces need tending, and frankly, some company wouldn't be the worst thing. Of course, second marriages came with social risk. In some communities, a widow who remarried too quickly was whispered about. How soon is too soon, people asked. Surely not during the funeral feast. There's one tale from 14th century Norfolk of a widow who remarried 6 weeks after burying her husband. Her defense, he was boring, respect. The church tried to regulate these things. Canon law technically allowed widows to remarry, but ideally with a period of mourning and definitely no carousing at harvest festivals in the meantime. A bishop in Rouen once preached a sermon titled, On the Dignity of Quiet Widowhood. It did not catch on. In the back, 3 widows were already passing notes. Scandal wasn't always about the timing, though. Sometimes it was about who you chose the second time around. A noblewoman might shock her kin by marrying a local blacksmith. A merchant's widow might wed her apprentice. These unions raised eyebrows. But they also raised eyebrows with assets marrying for affection rather than family alliances was radical, and not always frowned upon. Sometimes the gossip was worse if the second marriage seemed too happy. A widow with a younger husband, suspicious. A widow who suddenly laughed a lot more must be hiding something. And yet these relationships happened and thrived. And then there were the love letters. Widows now unbound by youthful obedience or maiden modesty could be surprisingly direct in their affections. Letters survive in which women ask suitors if they snore, if they drink too much, or if they are over fond of velvet. One particularly blunt letter from a Bristol widow reads, I like your eyes and your work ethic. Can you lift a barrel? Love at this stage in life came with clarity. You'd loved before. You'd lost. You understood what mattered and what didn't. Passion wasn't about stolen glances anymore. It was about someone who helped mend the fence and brought home the good cheese. But not all stories were happy. Some widows were pressured into remarriage, especially if they were young and fertile. Families might push them toward political matches. Town elders might suggest suitors for stability. A widow with property was a prize, and not always one she got to protect. Others chose not to marry again at all. Some entered convents not from devotion but to escape constant matchmaking. Others lived alone, quietly tending gardens, watching from porches, becoming neighborhood legends with pet geese and mysterious pasts. Still others kept their lovers but not their husbands. There's a case in Milan of a widow who refused all formal proposals yet lived with the same man for 20 years. When questioned, she replied, He is dear to me, but not enough to do the paperwork. Iconic. Historians note that widows often walked a fine line respected for their maturity, yet monitored for signs of impropriety. Too joyful, questionable. Too wealthy, dangerous. Too opinionated. Well, better marry her off before she starts writing pamphlets. And yet they were often the keepers of stories. The ones who remembered lost loves, who told tales of their youth, who whispered advice to the next generation. Take the one who listens, they'd say, not the one with shiny boots. So tonight, picture a woman sitting by candlelight, letter in hand, smirking as she decides between 2 suitors, one charming but penniless, the other wealthy but boring. Or neither. Maybe she keeps the cat and her independence. Or maybe she chooses love again on her own terms. Because in the quiet corners of history, amid all the formal betrothals and arranged unions, the widows often wrote their own stories with ink, with resilience, and occasionally with a goose feather quill, dipped in very fine wine. The convent walls rise high around you. Cool stone cloaked in ivy, the scent of beeswax and damp linen hanging in the morning air. The chapel bells have rung, the nuns have dispersed to their daily duties, and you find yourself seated in the cloister walk, brushing your fingers over a weathered wooden bench. Underneath, faintly carved where only one kneeling might see it, is a name. just a name, and a heart. Tonight you slip into the quiet, layered world of love in the cloister where nuns, brides of Christ, yes, but also women of blood and bone and longing, found space, however hidden, to feel deeply. To understand this world, you must first shed the idea of convents as places of cold austerity and emotionless obedience. Medieval convents were full living ecosystems, places of prayer, yes, but also of education, music, gardening, medicine, and sisterhood. Some women were sent there as children, others entered as adults. Some came by choice, others most definitely did not. And while the convent may have been designed to insulate its members from earthly love, human hearts have a way of making their own sanctuaries. Many of these women were deeply intellectual. They read, wrote, composed music, ran estates, and conducted correspondence. Some wrote passionate letters to each other, to priests, to women outside the convent walls. One 14th century German nun composed poetry for her beloved in Christ, a fellow sister who tended the apothecary garden. The lines are clear and not particularly subtle in thy eyes. I find the peace that prayer has not yet granted. Romantic, yes. Sanctified, also, yes. And then there were the artworks, illuminated manuscripts, filled with initials carefully drawn with extra flourishes. One set of letters from the Low Countries shows two nuns drawing small rabbits beside each other's names. Possibly symbolic. Possibly just rabbits. Historians still argue. Some believe these marks indicate courtship. Others say it's merely affectionate marginalia. But the rabbits are holding pause. Of course there were boundaries. The church's stance on sexuality within religious life was clear. None of that, thank you. Nuns took vows of chastity, and any hint of romantic or sexual behavior could result in serious punishment ranging from penance to expulsion. There are records of inquisitions visiting convents to root out irregular behavior. Their reports are sparse and usually full of euphemism. One simply states excessive warmth in communal embraces. Measures taken, and yet. The records also suggest affection persisted despite surveillance. Shared beds were not uncommon. Physical closeness, though often practical in cold stone dormitories, may have carried other meanings. In one English convent, a prioress was removed from her post for immoderate fondness toward a novice. She was replaced, the novice remained. Some of the most moving evidence comes not from scandal but from grief. Letters and prayers written after the death of a beloved fellow nun often read more like mourning for a spouse than a colleague. One entry in a convent obituary book reads, "She carried my heart into the Lord's keeping. I shall walk the cloister alone now." Another simply says, "We shared everything, even silence." But the cloister wasn't only filled with nun-on-nun affection. Many nuns carried on deep and sometimes intimate correspondences with men priests, monks, confessors, or male relatives. These letters were often emotional, sometimes romantic, occasionally scandalous. The most famous example is the letters of Eloise, who, long after being separated from Abelard and made abbess of a convent, continued to write him letters filled with longing intellect and occasional passive aggression. You bid me forget you. That is the most unforgivable thing of all. Not all these connections were tragic. Some were simply human. Companionship in a life that could be deeply isolating. A smile across the refectory, a song hummed together while scrubbing flagstones. Shared secrets behind garden walls. The kind of closeness that doesn't need to be defined to be real. Historians today approach these stories with care. Some are eager to reclaim them as evidence of queer identity in history. Others caution against applying modern terms too quickly. What is clear, though, is this nuns, like anyone, long to be seen, known, cherished. And they found ways, however small, however quiet. One poem from a French convent ends with the lines, "Though bound in veil and rule and right, my heart it drifts to you at night. Not sin but grace this love I bear, a candle lit from cloistered prayer." So tonight, as your breath slows and the candlelight fades, picture two women walking through a lavender garden after Vespers hands, brushing laughter caught in their throats. The world outside may never know, but inside these walls carved into benches hidden in hymnals, sung in harmony under stained glass, that love endures. The wind tastes of salt. It creeps through the cracks in the shutters and rattles the pewter goblet on the table. You sit by the hearth wrapped in your thickest cloak, hands numb with worry. Outside the waves crash endlessly, and in the firelight the single token left behind, a small wooden pendant carved with a cross and a tiny fish, gleams faintly. You haven't heard from him in months. He said he'd write from Acre, or Sicily, or Rome. You can't remember now, because loving a crusader means learning how to wait. And wait. And wait. Tonight, you're deep in the world of long-distance love in medieval times, where sweethearts were separated not by traffic jams or missed texts, but by ocean's plague war and sometimes years. When the call for crusade echoed through medieval Europe, thousands of men left home. Knights, squires, servants, dreamers, and debtors, all heading east to fight in the Holy Land. And behind them they left lovers, wives, betrothed, quiet admirers. People who didn't know if I'll return before winter meant this year, next year, or never. To say it tested relationships would be a dramatic understatement. First, there were promises made before departure. These ranged from formal marriage contracts signed the night before boarding the ship to whispered pacts in stable yards or crude carvings in tree bark. "Wait for me, I'll come back. You'll know me by this token." One knight reportedly cut a braid from his lover's hair and wore it around his wrist. When he finally returned, it had turned to dust in the heat. He married her anyway. Communication was rare. Letters were slow, expensive, and dangerous. A note might be entrusted to a passing monk, a merchant caravan, or a fellow soldier on return leave. Many were never delivered. Others were intercepted or damaged, smudged by rain, smeared with wax, carried across battlefields in satchels next to swords. One letter from a soldier near Jerusalem reads, "I have seen camel cities of stone and stars brighter than I thought possible, but none brighter than the memory of you." It's the kind of line that makes you wonder if he actually saw stars at all, or just a desert and a dream. Some wrote poetry tucking verses into psalters or scribbling them into the margins of prayer books. Others sent tokens, carved wooden rings, fragments of holy relics, real or imagined, or folded bits of cloth. One crusader mailed his beloved a dried rose from the plains outside Antioch. It arrived crumbled. She kept it anyway. Of course, temptation loomed on both sides. Crusaders were far from home, facing death daily. Some took comfort where they could local women fellow travelers, or companionship forged in hardship. There are reports, quiet sometimes, apologetic, of knights who fell in love abroad and never returned. One married the daughter of a Byzantine merchant, built a house in Cyprus, and sent home a letter that began, "Forgive me, but the sea has changed me." Back home, the waiting lovers had their own challenges. Uncertainty bred gossip. Neighbors questioned loyalties. Some suitors didn't wait at all. Others did, only to discover their beloved had changed or moved on. One woman in Normandy waited 7 years for her crusader fiancé. When he returned, she was a widow. Twice. They laughed, drank wine, and never married. They didn't need to. But not all stories were sad. Some couples survived the years of silence leaning on faith and fragments. A woman in Provence lit a candle every Friday and recited a psalm her husband had taught her. He returned after 5 years missing a hand, but grinning. They renewed their vows with a loaf of bread and a borrowed ring. Others kept their love alive through rituals. A ribbon tied to a tree outside the house. Bread baked with his favorite herbs. A line of prayer said at every Mass. Small acts, quiet fidelity, and not all long-distance lovers were separated by crusades. Trade pilgrimage military service arranged engagements all created distance. A scholar might leave for university and fall in love through letters alone. A merchant might travel for years, each stop accompanied by gifts and apologies. Some couples used go-betweens, family members, or trusted friends to carry messages and news. One betrothed pair in Cologne sent riddles back and forth through a cousin. They weren't just keeping love alive. They were flirting in code across borders. Historians still debate how many of these long-distance relationships truly lasted. But that may not be the point. Love in these conditions wasn't about guarantees. It was about hoping hard enough to risk the wait. So tonight, as the wind moans outside and your blanket gathers around your shoulders, imagine a world lit by flickering torches and faith. Somewhere, someone is crossing a sea with your name on their lips. Somewhere, someone lights a candle and whispers a prayer for your return. And even if the letters never come, the promise still lives in the drawer under the scarf beside the carved wooden ring that never quite fit but always meant everything. You sit on the edge of your straw-stuffed mattress, staring out through a narrow window carved deep into the stone. There's no view really, just mist, maybe a crow, but still you look. Because you're thinking about the ones who didn't leave letters. The ones with no carved initials, no wilted posies hidden in drawers, no names etched into prayer benches. The ones who loved but whose stories were never told. Tonight you've arrived at the end of the path, the part of medieval love that doesn't fit into neat categories or wedding records. This is the quiet realm of what the records don't say. Not every romance made it into a song, a marriage contract, or a scandalous inquisition. Some flickered briefly in silence like firelight behind closed shutters. A glance across a threshing floor. A whisper in a linen-draping alley. A promise broken by distance or class or fear. You won't find these lovers in chronicles or court rolls. But sometimes, just sometimes, they slip through. A faint line in a will to her, my warmest cloak. A side note scribbled in a monastery ledger left without cause but returned smiling. Or the way two graves tilt slightly toward each other, even though the stonecutter swore they were aligned. Historians try their best. They piece together fragments, receipts for matching shoes, herbal remedies paid for in pairs, the unexplained presence of someone in the background of an inheritance dispute. But so much is lost in silence, especially for those whose love defied rules. Women who loved women. Servants who fell for masters. Clerics who left no trace but a change in the way they signed their names. People who met on the road and shared a night or a season or a harvest before vanishing into each other's memory. Some stories were erased deliberately. Families removed names from letters. Churches scratched out lines from psalters. Entire chapters of affection were buried under layers of propriety. A nun's diary burned. A household account revised. A name replaced by a blank. Others simply faded. Peasants didn't keep journals. Lovers who couldn't write left no record. An apprentice might hold hands with a shepherd's son every Sunday, then marry a brewer's daughter, because that was what was expected. And no one ever knew, except maybe the dog. And yet the proof of their love lingers in other ways. In the folk songs that don't rhyme quite right because the name was changed. In the quilt stitched by two hands, though, only one woman's name is embroidered at the corner. In the collection of pressed flowers wrapped in a faded kerchief tucked inside the wall of a crumbling cottage found centuries later by someone who will never know what they meant. Sometimes you read between the lines of a chronicle between, they shared a household for many years and she remained unmarried until her death, and realize you're standing at the edge of an invisible story, a true one, just undocumented. And so we wonder how many loves were never spoken aloud, how many people chose quiet companionship over public recognition, how many waited, how many gave up, how many lived lives that to others looked ordinary but pulsed with a secret tenderness beneath the surface. Because medieval life was often brutal, short, controlled. But even within its narrow paths, people still found ways to make room for more. A second glance, a hand touched briefly at market, a scarf dropped on purpose, a late-night walk under the guise of prayer, a love that was real even if no one believed it or even knew. So tonight, as your thoughts begin to drift, allow yourself to imagine all the untold stories, not just the ones we sang about, but the ones we felt. The people who weren't saints or nobles or poets, just two souls who met, paused, and stayed close. They may not have a plaque or a sonnet, but they had each other. And now, in this quiet moment, they have you remembering them even without their names. And now the candles are low. The wind has quieted. You've traveled through halls and hedgerows, chapels and courtyards, markets, moats, and cloisters, watching love bloom awkwardly, bravely, softly in every dusty corner of the medieval world. Let the stories settle now. Let them soften and drift. The stolen glances, the embroidered notes, the letters that never came, the ribbons passed from sleeve to sleeve, all of it folding into the stillness of night. Not every love had a feast day or a blessing. Some began in silence. Some ended there too. But none of them were wasted. Because even then, even under woolen layers, behind rules and rituals and centuries of dust, people reached for each other. Laughed, blushed, waited, hoped. Just like you do now. So, as you rest your head and close your eyes, may you carry their quiet joy with you. The courage it took to risk affection. The softness it took to remain kind in a hard world. And the reminder that love, however it appears, is never out of place. You're safe here beneath these blankets beside these stories. No troubadours needed, no bands or tokens, just time, just breath. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.